Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. We know that the economy has taken a hit with COVID lockdowns and with government spending in programs like CERB or CEWS. Our national debt has hit an all-time high of $1 trillion. But how will we dig ourselves out? How do we pay for all this debt, or at the very least cover our budget? One Liberal MP had a solution with a one-time wealth tax as introduced in his private member's motion M68. The Parliamentary Budget Office, or the PBO, recently released his report on their study of M68. Well, suffice to say, the PBO reported that even a wealth tax wouldn't cover the gap in the budget. So just how should Canada proceed? Is a new one-time wealth tax a good idea? Is any tax ever really temporary? Or will we be chasing away high net worth Canadians with this new type of tax? Well, joining me now to discuss the PBO report and to share the findings of his own debt report is Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Franco Terrazzano. Franco, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to dive right into this debt and figure out if we have a solution here with a new wealth tax.
Well, hey, thank you so much for having me on, and you got my name perfectly. That was amazing.
Okay, this is my trips to Italy that helped me out there. So there we go. Okay, so before we talk about this new proposal of a wealth tax, is there another jurisdiction in the world that has something similar, that does actually have a wealth tax? What is it, and where else do we see something like this?
Well, we should learn from experiences from other countries, and we've seen more than a handful of countries try a wealth tax and then abandon a wealth tax. And the reason is because it's very bad policy. I mean, we can get into the nuts and bolts, but it's very costly, it's very complex, and wealth taxes can come with very damaging economic consequences. And, right now, as we think about how to emerge from this COVID-19 downturn, the last thing that politicians in Ottawa should be thinking about are higher taxes, especially these type of damaging taxes such as a wealth tax.
Okay, well, is there another jurisdiction in the world that still, that implemented a wealth tax and still has it? I know you said many have abandoned it. Is anybody still latching on?
Well, I mean, there's talks around the world of introducing a wealth tax. I think the jurisdiction that we can learn from the most is from France, right? So let's look at the economic consequences that occurred in France. Well, they had a wealth tax, they had high taxes, and what happened is that they chased away thousands of residents. They chased away billions of dollars in assets. I mean, billions and billions of dollars in assets, and that's why eventually they said goodbye to their wealth tax. And really, I think if we look at the international response and the international experience, we should learn to say no to a wealth tax in Canada.
Okay, but even though I do hear rumblings south of the border that they're considering a wealth tax, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe my news is out of date. So then I wonder if the world's biggest economy is even considering a wealth tax, then is this the direction that maybe the rest of the world is or ought to be headed?
Well, respectfully, I mean, if the U.S. wants to put in bad policies that are going to damage their taxpayers, that are going to damage their economy, we should let them, right? Let the United States raise taxes if that's what the U.S. wants to do. And quite frankly, we should be in Canada encouraging investment, encouraging talent to set up shop here if other countries want to move in the wrong direction. Okay,
so let's talk about this private member's motion, M68. So it was introduced by a Liberal MP, which is the governing party federally. What were some of your concerns with this introduction? I know we kind of scratched a little bit of the surface here, but tell me a little bit more in depth.
Well, we really see this as a silly political posturing, right? We talked about some of the economic damages and consequences that can happen from a wealth tax, but not only would this harm the economy, I mean, it would even put a dent into the massive debt tab that we're facing, right? The federal government is more than $1 trillion in debt. And really, that's the reason why you have politicians in Ottawa who are musing about these new types of taxes, about these tax hikes, because you have members of parliament that are really tripping over themselves, trying to figure out how they're going to pay this $1 trillion debt tab. And I think as average Canadians, me and you, I think what we need to be honest with ourselves here. And if these politicians don't actually figure out a way to cut back on spending, it's going to be average taxpayers that end up getting clobbered.
Yes, and I think that's always the concern when we have high spending. We have 30 seconds before we go to commercial, but just we'll delve into the nuts and bolts in a moment. But in the 30 seconds, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, what was his initial take to this M68?
Well, he found that this could generate about $60 billion in government revenue, but really that's a $60 billion hit to taxpayers over 5 years to our private sector economy. And let's remember, I mean, Trudeau's deficit spending is so high that he would burn through that cash in about a month.
Okay.
So who's going to be picking up the tab the other 11 months?
Okay, we're going to go to commercial. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're having a lively discussion on debt and taxes with Franco Terrazzano, the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And I say a lively discussion because we are discussing the potential implementation of a new tax. And we should all be going, oh, what's this about? So Franco, before the break, you were doing an excellent job of explaining a little bit of what a wealth tax is, where it's been implemented. But let's talk more importantly what the Parliamentary Budget Office and its officer had to say about it. It suggests that the wealth tax, as you mentioned, wouldn't even cover the gap in the budget. So why even bother with something like this?
Yeah, well, not even close, right? And not only would it not cover the gap in the budget, I mean, like I said, it's going to impose some damage to our economy at the worst possible time. So what the Parliamentary Budget Officer found is that this could bring in about $60 billion over 5 years, right? I kind of broke that down. Trudeau would burn through that spending with his deficit spending in about a month. But over 5 years, to underscore just how big the deficit problem is in Canada, even if we have this damaging wealth tax, the budget gap would still be over $270 billion over those 5 years. And you know, the government does need to take the debt problem seriously, but it needs to do that by reining in years of overspending.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that this potential or proposed rather wealth tax wouldn't even do anything. In fact, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, he actually balked at the idea of a wealth tax and suggested this one-time tax ought to really be an ongoing tax on the ultra-rich. Is he an outlier here amongst politicians?
Well, I think that's what taxpayers really need to be on guard here, right? It's that slippery slope of taxation. You know, you hear a one-time tax and you should almost laugh at it, right? Like, I'm going to have just one bite of cheesecake after dinner. Come on, right? And just let's look throughout history. Remember, the income tax was introduced in 1917 to deal with the government's war spending of World War I. Well, World War I is long gone, thankfully, and we still have an income tax. So we just have to remember that whenever we're talking about taxation, is that slippery slope. And one more point on that. So I mentioned that France had its wealth tax. Well, eventually, over time, they started trapping in more taxpayers under the wealth tax as they stopped moving the threshold with inflation. So we just have to remember the slippery slope of taxation here.
Okay, that's actually a very interesting point you just brought up, because I do recall the France case, and I do recall that many, to use the expression of Jagmeet Singh, ultra-rich, found tax shelters elsewhere or vacated the country so that they wouldn't have to pay this new tax that France had implemented. But you're suggesting now that the window for taxation actually shifted more to capture more of the middle class?
Yeah. So how the wealth tax work is essentially you have a threshold, right? And if you make above that threshold, you get hit with the tax. And the threshold initially would move every year with inflation. Well, eventually the French government, I guess they wanted more money. They stopped moving that threshold with inflation, and more taxpayers would get bumped into paying that wealth tax as their property values rose.
Okay, I understand. I think I can see where potential problems might lie if something like this were implemented. However, on the flip side, you know, Canadians, we are a generous lot, and many don't mind opening up their wallets and paying a little bit extra if they're going to have a good program, and especially during the times of COVID lockdowns. I mean, there might be lockdown fatigue now, but especially in the early months, I think people really thought we had to, you know, the government had to step in there and do something, and businesses were very grateful for that. Now, those chickens are coming home to roost in a sense that we're now getting the bill, and we're finding that there's a big gap there in terms of what we can afford and what we have. What is the solution here? You know, it sounds like CERB, the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, is winding down. CEWS, I assume so as well. Could this potentially actually really just be temporary? Meaning, once we get over this hump that COVID dealt us, that we could actually be back where we should be in good fiscal footing?
Well, taxpayers are already paying our fair share. We're already paying a lot. Businesses are already paying their fair share. They're already paying a lot, right? When is it time for politicians and government really to start paying their fair share? Now, let's remember here, we are not talking about a federal budget that is cut to the bone. We are talking about a lot of fat on that government stake in Ottawa, right? Our members of parliament have received not one, but two pay raises while millions of Canadians struggled through COVID-19. That is a slap in the face to so many taxpayers, so many private sector workers who took huge pay cuts, who maybe lost their job. What about all the small business owners who had to hand out those pink slips or who saw the revenue evaporate before their very eyes? I mean, quite frankly, Canadian taxpayers, we have been paying our fair share. It's really time for government to rein in the spending and to tighten the belt. You know, I talk about the MP pay raises, two of them during COVID-19. Well, let's look at the jobs numbers, right?
Okay, you know what? I'm going to pause you there. I want to pick this up, but we've got to cut to commercial. We'll be right back.
Perfect.
Welcome back. We're picking up our discussion with Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Franco Terrazzano. Franco, we were discussing job numbers and the recently released ones. Why don't you start expounding on that?
Yeah, well, you know, it's really unfortunate to say this, but it's just been the reality is that we've seen a tale of two pandemics during COVID-19. You know, we've seen the private sector go through a ton of pain, but we really haven't seen government being willing to share in the tough times. And the recently released jobs numbers from Stats Canada, we've seen thousands of private sector job losses during COVID-19. And during that time, we've seen thousands of additional government bureaucrat jobs, right? Which means a higher tax burden for so many families and so many businesses who've been struggling over the last year. And not only additional government job increases, but we've also seen thousands of government bureaucrats across Canada receive pay raises during lockdowns in 2020. So there has been a clear divide during this downturn.
Now, when you say pay raises, because you mentioned before commercial that politicians gave themselves, I think you said politicians did two pay raises, and the bureaucracy as well has received pay raises. What kind of pay raises are these? Are these like cost of living adjustments? Are these pegged to inflation? Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, there's a few different things here, right? So in one way, they could be negotiated pay raises, right? So they're negotiated into their contract. Another way could be step increases, where maybe they don't get an overall increase in terms of negotiated, but they move up their step within the agreement. But either way, that's taxpayers who have gone through a very difficult time who have to pick up that tab. And the one thing that we haven't really heard of is government pay reductions. In fact, you know, the federal government has no records of its employees ever receiving a pay cut. And that's from information from the think tank secondstreet.org.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. And we did have actually Colin Craig from Second Street on to discuss this several months ago. So you've triggered my memory here. But this is a good point you mentioned. You know, so many families have had to tighten their purse strings to make ends meet, be it because they were laid off, they had a small business that was not allowed to open during a lockdown or something to that effect. So they have been tightening their purse strings. And I guess that's a good point to make, that why isn't our government, why isn't our bureaucracy at least demonstrating? And so can I say clearly that there has been zero demonstration of that, or are you just telling me one side of the story here?
No, I mean, we haven't seen our politicians being willing to share in the tough times at the federal level, right? They've received two pay raises, and it doesn't have to be like that. And it hasn't been like that everywhere. Let's look at New Zealand. Almost immediately, we saw their Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. She stood up and she said, we are going to stand in solidarity with struggling taxpayers who are paying the bills. And you saw the Prime Minister in New Zealand take a 20% cut along with her ministers and chief government bureaucrats, right? So we haven't seen our politicians or government bureaucrats be willing to share in the tough times in Canada, but we have seen it elsewhere.
And I think that's a beautiful demonstration of leadership. I think that's what Canadians want to see, that we really are all in this together, to use that phrase. You also recently released a debt report, and we sort of touched upon it or pranced around it, demonstrating how much debt each Canadian carries. And some of these numbers really shocked me. What do I carry as a citizen, as a Canadian citizen living in Ontario?
Well, it's more than $57,000, more than $57,000. And that takes into consideration both federal and provincial government debt, right? Because at the end of the day, there is only one taxpayer. And those numbers are projections to the end of the year, but it's crazy. I mean, more than $57,000 in government debt that each Canadian owes if politicians don't actually find some ways to save money. And, I don't know about you, but I don't got tens of thousands of dollars lying around to pay for these government credit card bills.
Well, that's certainly most Canadians don't, especially during these times. Hopefully, the economy is picking up, and we have seen good signs, and that's a good thing. It shows the resilience of our economy, but that doesn't mean you're right, a carte blanche to go spend. Interest costs, we talk about servicing our debt. So there's the amount of debt that each of us carries, but we're also servicing $1 trillion of debt. How much does each citizen, I guess you could say annually, pay to service that debt in the 45 seconds we have left?
Yeah, well, you bring up a very good point. So each Canadian on average is going to be paying about $1,000 in government interest costs, provincial, federal this year. Remember, that's $1,000 that can't go to healthcare. That's $1,000 that isn't staying in our pockets because it has to go to the bond fund managers on Bay Street to service that debt.
My goodness. And again, 30 seconds before we go to commercial, are we alone in the world of the G7 nations where we have this tremendous debt?
Well, we're not in a good spot. We rank very high when you look at 29 other industrialized countries. When you look at debt to GDP, we're about fifth highest among those 29 industrialized countries, according to the IMF. So we're not in a good spot.
Okay. Well, we're going to pick up this discussion right when we return from commercial break. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on the status of Canada's debt and the potential implementation of a new wealth tax. It might be on the horizon. Will it be implemented? We will see. But let's talk about spending in times of crisis. I look to the south of the border and remember FDR and the New Deal. And yes, that's almost 100 years ago, but their debt in the United States reached $33 billion by 1933. And some will argue that this is a way, in a sense, that the world is built. It's built on debt, on borrowing, and roads get built, and then we keep borrowing and we build other things. America is still the biggest economy, 100 years later almost, still carrying a massive debt. If they can survive this, why wouldn't Canada?
Well, I think we have to go back to a lesson that we all learn at a young age, or at least earlier in life, is just because your friend's doing something silly doesn't mean you should also do something silly. Now, I do think it's very important to learn from our history. And let's talk about the 90s, right? Because leading up to the 90s, we had a lot of politicians, including provincial politicians, that kept kicking the debt problem down the road. And what happened in the 90s, especially in those prairie provinces where they had to make very, very tough decisions. Remember, in Saskatchewan, they ended up having to close more than 50 hospitals across that province, right? And that brings up a very crucial point. You want to address a debt problem before it becomes a really, really big issue. So we need to make tough choices now before we're forced to make even tougher decisions in the future.
And, I was just a child in the 90s. And, you saying that we had to close 50 hospitals in one province, I mean, that's shocking, especially coming out of, a COVID health crisis, if you will, where there was demands for greater ICU capacity, more beds in hospitals, and really shone a light onto some issues within the healthcare system. I can't imagine the thought of closing a hospital, knowing we have an aging population and a growing population. So this is actually a potential. Like, if we do not manage our debt, we could face something as tragic like shutting down a hospital?
Well, look, I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody has a crystal ball, but we have to remember the fundamentals, right? And we talked about the interest costs, where each Canadian this year, the cost of interest is more than $1,000 per person. And it's just simple math. The more money that has to go to service the debt, the more money that goes to Bay Street to service this government interest cost, the less money that we have for services. You let that money keep growing and growing and growing, and that cost go up. We have less money for services. We have less money for lowering taxes. That's just the simple math there.
Okay, in the couple of minutes we have left of the program, the 2 minutes left, I always like to think of solutions. What's the best way forward? How can we make this better? What kind of practical things would you like to see the government do? What kind of programs do you like to see stop or implemented? New tax cuts or none at all? Share with me what you think the government ought to be doing.
Well, we do have to take this $1 trillion debt problem very seriously. But right now, the Trudeau government isn't taking that problem serious. Case in point is the last budget that we just saw, Budget 2021, where they are going to raise permanent government spending by $100 billion by 2026 with absolutely no plans on how to pay for it. So we really need to see our government take it serious. And here's 3 ways that they can rein in the spending. First, leadership at the top. Our members of parliament need to take a pay cut. The second thing is we need to see our government employees being willing to share in the tough times as well. And third, we need a taxpayer-led and friendly recovery. We don't need our politicians and bureaucrats running around trying to play investment banker with our tax dollars.
Very well said. And as Canadians, as individual taxpayers, what do you think we ought to be doing?
Well, we have to tell our members of parliament, our politicians, to take it serious, right? Because each Canadian on average owes more than $57,000 in government debt if politicians don't find some ways to save money. So every time we hear this new massive spending announcement coming from the Trudeau government, we have to ask a simple question. How are you going to pay for it?
Okay, well, those are some excellent words. And I think on that note, we'll wrap it up. But thank you so much, Franco Terrazzano. And I guess we'll have to see what happens in the coming days. Thank you so much.
Well, hey, thank you so much for having me on.
$1 trillion debt is a huge amount, especially for a country like Canada. And when we know that we're carrying $57,000 of debt per person in this nation, it really has to make us wonder, what can we do to bring that debt down? Is a wealth tax a solution? Based on what the parliamentary budget officer said, probably not. It's just literally putting your finger in the dam. We'll see what happens and if such a tax will get implemented. But for Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.